Hello, everyone, and welcome for making it into the hottest, sweatiest tent at Conservative Party conference, but thankfully the driest, and not just in a political sense. I'm Sebastian Payne. I'm director of Onward, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here for one of our most exciting events of conference, which is titled The Nice Small Question of What is the Future of Conservatism. Thank you all for turning out, and if you would like to tweet and follow this along, we're at UK Onward, and of course hashtag CPC23. So why are we sitting here to be doing this? The fact is that Conservatives have much to be proud of over the last 13 years. We are the party of patriotism, of pragmatism, and good government, but there are some big new challenges facing us all, as we know, with the rise of China, trade wars, rapid cultural and economic change. They all pose a big question to what we call at Onward our national community. When I started Onward at the beginning of this year, one of the projects that I thought enticed me the most to leave the happy comfort light of journalism was about defining the future of conservatism. And we'll soon be publishing our first paper, which has been written by the great Gavin Rice, who is standing smiling at the back there, and Nick Timothy on the left here. And that will be coming out next week, and we're seeing this event as teeing it up and trying to ask each of these amazing people on our panelists what is their future of conservatism. And I feel like no one needs much introduction, but I'll do it anyway. On my far left, not politically of course, is Nick Timothy, who is the chair of the Future of Conservatism project at Onward. He previously was Chief of Staff in Downing Street under Theresa May, is a Daily Telegraph columnist, and likes to call himself the new Matt Hancock, as he is the prospective parliamentary candidate for West Suffolk.
Ouch! I felt that.
We also have, also to my left, is Tom Tugendhat, who is the Security Minister and previously an Onward board member, I believe, as well. We also have Laura Farris, who is the MP for Newbury, Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, and Imogen Sinclair, who is Director of the new Social Covenant Unit. So I'm going to begin this by going to Michael first, about asking, you've written a lot throughout your career and have talked a lot about what exactly is the future of conservatism. So with our project in mind, which you are very kindly chairing the steering group, what is your future of conservatism?
You, Seb, is the first way of answering that question, because the work that Onward is doing, I think, has contributed to wrestling with the problems that we now face. It is sometimes the case that Conservatives look back with affection. Understandably, we should be proud of our past and our traditions. But it is also sometimes the case that when people are looking at the renewal of Conservatism, they look back, they're enchanted by the romance of some of the crusaders of the past, and they think, well, let's do what they did. But we are not living through a period where the answer is to revive the exact policies that, for example, Margaret Thatcher introduced. What we need to do is to revive the spirit that she brought to things. And the spirit that she brought to things was a clear-eyed analysis of the individual challenges that we faced. And the challenges that we faced in the 1980s, overmighty trades unions, for example, they're not the challenges that we principally face now. Seb pointed out what those challenges are. We live in a world which has grown insecure and more fragile as the consensus behind globalization has fractured. The impact that we saw of economic nationalism during the pandemic, the increased way in which competitors, China and others, are seeking to secure permanent economic advantage, compels us to think again about the resilience of our national economy. So I think there are three particular things that I would say are at the heart of the future of conservatism: solidarity, security, and social justice. Solidarity. We need to rediscover a shared national spirit of endeavour, a spirit of community, and a spirit that seeks to transcend the culture wars and the polarisation which we've seen, sadly, lead to internal political and economic and social division in our country. We need to recognise that it is the responsibility of our leaders to make sure that every individual feels that their views are valued and that their future is of concern. We've suffered in the past from the condescension of those in power towards those who've expressed discontents, and we've also suffered as a result of economic inequality, particularly inequality of wealth, making people feel that they are not part of our national community, not part of our broader family. Security. This I will defer to Tom on, is one area I think that every Conservative recognises that we need to take more seriously. The nature of threats, both domestic and international, are proliferating. We need to be sure that our security is not just there in terms of the support that we give to our armed forces and the support that we give to our intelligence and security agencies, but also there in the way in which we look at our domestic economic needs, the supply chains upon which our industry depends, and that we need to take a unashamedly strategic approach towards the economy. And one of the people who's written best about this, apart from Gavin Anthony Rice, is Juliet Samuel. The final thing I would say is social justice, and it links the two things that I have just mentioned. We are at our best as a party when we are determined to reform in order to ensure that every member of our nation, every member of our national community shares in our success. So, it was the case throughout the history of the Conservative Party that wherever there were individuals who, because of the roiling pace of economic change, found themselves either dislocated or disadvantaged, that Conservatives have been on their side. So the great reforming administrations of Disraeli and Salisbury were concerned explicitly to deal with the changes that the Industrial Revolution had wrought, the need to ensure that the new housing and indeed the environment in which people were now living and working was fit, humane, habitable. Similarly, the reforms that we've brought in the last 13 years to education and welfare have been explicitly designed to help the most disadvantaged in our society have the opportunity to choose their future and the opportunity to participate fully in the labour market. And we have got to look at the emerging threats and dangers to those who, for whatever reason, are the least advantaged in our society, because the flip side of believing in a national community is recognising that if we are to succeed in that endeavour, we do need to take everyone with us.
Thank you very much, Michael. Now, Tom, I'm going to come to you next, because I think obviously one of the themes that we've touched on our project and Michael's talked about is security. And when people think about the security minister, they think of much more traditional things in terms of threats from bad actors. But the way you've approached this role is very different, looking at obviously economic security as well as the national one. So when thinking about what your future of Conservatism is, how does security in particular fit into that?
Well, thanks, Seb, and thank you, Michael. You've set me up very well, because the reality is that I think about security in several ways, but one of them aligns very closely with the way I think about conservatism, which is not what conservatism is, but who it is. And when you look at polls like one that was out very recently that said 1% of 18 to 24-year-olds were minded to vote Conservative, you can see that we're in for a bit of a challenge. I know that a lot of us have aspired to the 1%, but that isn't the 1% that we've aspired to. What we've instead aspired to is making sure that we have a conservative policy, a conservative country, not just because we want to win elections, but because we want the country to be shaped in ways that we know matters. If we're going to have security, we need to have cohesion. If we're going to have security, we need to have a contract between generations. If we're going to have security, we need to have a stake in society. And that is where our conservatism needs to go. Now, a lot of work on this has already been done, particularly by you, Michael. And the way that you've focused on house building in recent reforms has been incredibly important, because house building, or rather home ownership, is the totem of having a stake in society. It is the absolute commitment that we as Conservatives mean it when we say we believe in place, not just people. And when we're here in Manchester, or indeed in Birmingham, when we go anywhere in the United Kingdom, making sure that we recognise that the place matters, not just people, is incredibly important. People can move, that's true. But if they do, they lose family, they lose community, and they lose that cohesion. So finding ways to keep that together is incredibly important, because we do believe in place, we do believe in family, though we also believe in the freedom to define your own family. I hope the roof holds. Did you fix the roof while the sun was shining? The other point that Michael made so correctly is when we talk about security, we talk about a society that works together. And here we need to be really clear. When we play in identity games, in the kind of games that lead us to single out and to divide, we're playing a game that socialists play so well, but it's fundamentally unconservative. It's unconservative because conservatives build and conservatives unite. Conservatives look at a community and try to make sure that that community has integrity and has internal cohesion, because it's very hard to know what your country is if you don't feel at home in your community. And that's where we need to be massively investing, because if we cannot build communities, we cannot build our country. So, as we look at the future of conservatism, the challenge is clear. It's looking, as Michael said, not at what Margaret Thatcher did, but at the example that she inspired. And that example was one of ownership, in her case of homes. It was one of inclusion and having a stake in society, in her case, the nationalised industries. And it was one of making sure that we were secure at home and in the appropriate investment in our security. And all of those, as examples, are policies that we should be following today.
Thank you very much, Tom. Laura, I'd like to come to you on this question of community, which people have talked about quite a lot. And in our work at Onward, we talk about the national community, which is where you have the economic and the social interacting in a much more closer way. And that's not to say the state is intervening or doing everything, but it's that they work much more closely. And I think when you're talking about your future of conservatism, how do you see that?
Well, I think when I started to approach this exercise, I thought about the perspective of somebody who was I don't think they're called a millennial, but somebody who was born in the millennium, give or take, maybe from 1995 onwards, what their experience of conservatism might have been. And if you think about the values that we would perhaps at the most fundamental level associate with conservatism, so a smaller state, trust in our institutions, incremental social change, all three of those things have been completely upended in the lifetime of that person who may be somewhere between the age of 20 and 30 now. They will have known the financial crisis, which was a complete collapse in trust in financial institutions, followed by Brexit, which, however you feel about it or look at it, represented wrenching change. And then the era of the pandemic, which was a huge degree of state intervention, unprecedented in my lifetime. And you could be completely forgiven for being 25 or 30 years old and feeling that you'd lived through quite a lengthy era of Conservative government, but you were unfamiliar with the principles of conservatism. And we can talk about, causation, but with the pandemic particularly, the government had to do what it did, but it wasn't traditional conservatism. And I thought about, in that context, where I thought the opportunities for conservatism lay and also where the obstacles still exist. And I think really the great opportunity, which has the ability to fundamentally reimagine the construction of the state, is in the development of AI. And we still have this sort of very slight tendency to talk about the future of sort of driverless cars and machines or technologies that can draft legal documents or settle legal disputes or design buildings. But actually, that's not the future. That's now. And we have the ability, undoubtedly, to shrink the size of some of our most important public services and make them far more efficient, streamlined, personalised, targeted in a way that I don't think any public service reform that I've ever really thought about has been capable of being improved and made more efficient other than through AI. But where I also think conservatism has a lot of work to do is on what AI will mean for work. Michael rightly talked about our achievements in education, and I feel very close to this because my kids have gone through primary school, a free school, through the era of this government, and I've seen the effect of his educational reforms, the amazing work on literacy, the new focus on skills, taking skills training as something that's not sort of patronised as being inferior to going to university, but as equivalent, if not, frankly, in many cases, more desirable because of the way that you can develop both income and professional ability through the same years when you might otherwise be at university. We also talk all the time about being a science superpower and all of that stuff, but one of the things I think we say much less about is what the future of work looks like. And with AI developing at the rate it is, there is a serious issue of task encroachment. And I think any serious policymaker, from whatever party they're from, needs to consider the possibility that in the years that are not too far ahead of us, there will not be enough well-paid work that is available for people. And I think it's fair to say, and I'm not mounting any criticism, that the immediate call that will go up from the left will be probably through the trade unions seeking to renegotiate protections for workers. I think the AI tsunami is far greater than that, and I think that sort of collective bargaining will completely collapse, actually. And the second thing that I think is going to become more compelling is the call for a universal basic income. And I think as Conservatives, we need to think very carefully about how we're equipping people for the future. I don't think I'm sure everybody's heard the same thing, people need to learn to do the jobs that robots can't do, like be a therapist or something, but that's not going to be enough. Whether you should be building the systems or how we prepare ourselves for a world where really there isn't enough work and how we see the structure of society. That's a challenge and it's an opportunity for conservatism. And in Parliament, if I'm honest, I don't think I've heard anyone talking about it seriously enough yet. My final comment was again to align myself with something that Michael said about culture wars and how unbelievably harmful they've been. And another feature that would be another reality that would be the feature of the life of anyone born in the era I said at the beginning of my presentation is that they will have grown up in the social media world where algorithms exist to reinforce prejudices, to eliminate doubt and nuance in political argument, and in a way that's been incredibly unhelpful. And that, I think, has massively exacerbated a problem, but it doesn't mean that there aren't big cultural questions on the horizon. And again, I think this actually is a challenge to the Conservatives, because if you look at the last 50 years and you look at the development of social justice law, you look at the Equal Pay Act in 1970, the Sex Discrimination Act in 1975, the Race Relations Act in 1976, all Labour legislation. Yes, the Conservative Party passed the Disability Discrimination Act in 1995, but they were borrowing quite a lot of the statutory language that had already been really subsumed by the left. And I think that we need to move out of sort of ducking these questions or leaving them for another, or thinking they belong in the realms of a different political tribe and defining them more ourselves. I could say a bit more about that, but I think I've spoken long enough.
Thank you, Laura. And I think AI is going to be the most fascinating debate for Conservatives to think about, because as you can already see, the natural inclination is for the state to regulate it, to try and stop the potential harmful impacts. And I think in the general election, whenever it may come, this will actually be quite a big debate, because there will be people on the left who say you've got to act hard and regulate. On the right, we've got to get that balance right, to embrace the opportunities to help public services, but also to allow enterprise to flourish on that. And on that point, I'm going to come to Nick now, because in the drafting of the first Future Conservatism paper, a lot of it is about the economy, and you've thought an awful lot about this, and looking back over the last 4 decades, and there's been quite a few mentions of a former Conservative Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, here, in terms of the economic settlement she did. Your future of conservatism is something that really challenges that economic settlement.
Yeah, I think what Tom said about Margaret Thatcher is correct. She brought solutions to problems that existed in the late 70s, and she saved the country. But the lesson from Margaret Thatcher is not to try to fix problems that existed then but are different now, but to draw from her principles to the things we do now and in the future. I was thinking when Laura was just talking, I go to do quite a lot of talks at universities and colleges, and I talk about what conservatism means to me, and quite often afterwards somebody will put up their hand and they'll say, well, I sort of think of myself as on the left, but I didn't really disagree with what you were saying. And I think the reason for this, and it does actually happen pretty much every time I speak at one of these places, is because we've allowed people to perceive conservatism as individualism, and actually at worst, selfishness. And I think, obviously, conservatism is an incredibly rich tradition. Yes, it's about freedom, but it's also about lots of other values too. And when we think about the economy, Seb, I think it's really important that we actually think about what it is we're trying to achieve and why it is that we want a strong economy. And to answer that, I think, well, sort of, why am I a conservative? And I imagine this is probably true of most people in the room. When I first became a conservative or realised I was a conservative, it wasn't because, I had suddenly woke up one day and thought, God, I really think the percentage of the economy that should go towards the state is X percent of GDP. I didn't think, I wasn't won over by a particular economic theory. It wasn't even because I believed in sort of one particular institution. It's because I really believed in community. That is, I was lucky enough to be brought up in a really strong and loving family. That is family. It's about the places that mean something to you. It's about relationships and the obligations and duties that are placed on you, as well as the things you receive from those obligations. It's what, I can see Danny Kruger over there, it's what he calls the call of home. It's what Onward used to call in some of their earlier projects the politics of belonging. Those are the reasons I'm a conservative, and I think those are the reasons why actually most people are conservatives and why conservatism is actually appealing to people. Now, you could say, well, who doesn't believe in those things? But actually, if you look at liberalism, it's about trying to escape those kinds of obligations. If you look at the politics of the left, it's about the pursuit of equality to the extent that you would actually attack some of those institutions because some of them might be unfair or unequal. Or these days, because of identity politics, it might be more about things like what they call communities of experience, rather than communities of place or relationships. And even the kind of supposedly apolitical technocrats who exist in government, who lead the kind of policy making by impact assessment, where they're laden with assumptions about the way the world works, and the data that gets put in is skewed, so the data that comes out is skewed. If you look at each of these people, the attitude to community is either that we should escape it, we should divide it, or we should ignore it. And so I think conservatism actually is the one school of thought that actually does take community very seriously. Well, what does it mean? I think we have to put community right in the heart of everything we do. We need to recognise that social policy and economic policy are actually completely interwoven, and it's a completely false distinction to think of them in different terms. A strong economy relies on lots of non-capitalist goods like the love of families, social trust and things like that. But obviously the strength of our society it depends a little bit on how wealthy we are, how much time people have to give to others, the things that we can invest in helping less fortunate members of our community. So I think, so to me that means on society we need to be reasonably robust on the kind of culture war issues that the left obsesses about, but actually we need to do that in an intellectually coherent way and not do it in a way that looks like we're crossing the road for a fight for tactical reasons. We need, I think, a positive programme, putting family first, thinking about institutions and norms of behaviour, trying to find ways of helping people and communities to help themselves. And on the economy, I think our model has run out of road, and I think we need to go big, and we need to go full spectrum in the way we think about that. So some of these things will be exactly what members of the political right like to think about and talk about. We have over-regulated our economy again. That is something that we need to address. But while we need to get the state out of life in some ways, we need to also accept that the state has a role, a strategic role, as Michael said, if we are to rebalance the economy in the way that we need to, both sectorally and geographically. And I think we need to also recognise some things that I think we used to think were slightly passé to think about, like the trade deficit. We need to recognise that actually we don't make, do or sell enough of what the world needs, and that needs to change.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I think one way to sum up the worldview is to say that the state is both overbearing and underwhelming at the same time. There are areas where the British state is sort of stifling enterprise, but areas where it's not doing enough to help, and getting into this kind of reductive argument about what particular tax rate is at something doesn't help this at all, because we need to really start from the ground zero, which is what we're doing at Onward. But, of course, finally, Imogen, the one thing that we've talked a lot about has been the role of family in this. And when we're thinking about your vision of the future of conservatism, do you think Conservatives have been bold enough on what family is, and how should that play into the future of it?
No, probably not. But the future of Conservatism, Seb, is secure in the 2019 mandate, which we still have. Millions of people voted Conservative for the first time at some personal cost. Former Labour voters broke habits with generations and voted for a party with which they had no historic affinity. And that it was that pledge to finally get Brexit done after years of attempting to escape the tentacles of the European Union, appealed finally to low-income families living in northern neighbourhoods who felt alienated from power. And that monumental political realignment saw the emergence of what we now have, our new coalition of Conservative voters. The traditional southern, rural, middle-class Conservative voter base was augmented with northern, urban, working-class voters, and we must retain these votes. And we know that we must retain these votes. What happened in 2019 was people voted for radical regime change, to be a self-governing nation once again. And this is the persisting will of the people. In 2016, 2017, 2019. We heard it louder and louder each time. And we need to remember this very, very recent history. And I was struck by a poll recently I read in, I think it was The Spectator, that found that 58% of our new coalition of voters agree with the statement, Britain is broken, people are getting poorer, nothing seems to work properly. And I think people are asking, will a change in government make much difference to our increasingly expensive and generally insecure lives? And I worry about this. I really worry that the public's confidence in any or all political parties is dwindling because of a doubt. And it's a doubt that a Labour Party will be appropriately socialist, or a Conservative Party will be appropriately conservative or right of centre, and that voting in British elections is now akin to gambling. Do we really know what we're voting for? And we need our Conservative voters to have confidence that they're going to get a Conservative government if they vote Conservative. And the lesson from Uxbridge was clear, which is that we need to punch left. Assertiveness is key. And I think this is a problem for us, and I'd like to explain why, and it echoes much of what Nick's already said, so I'll keep it brief. But Patrick Deneen, he's an American political academic, authored a book called Why Liberalism Failed, and he sets the record straight on John Stuart Mill. Right, so many people in our party describe themselves as classically liberal, that's fine, and they see John Stuart Mill as their hero, the great advocate for freedom, but in fact, Mill's appeal to this atmosphere of freedom was designed to aggressively undermine the custom-bound society of his time. So in short, the lesson, I think, is the absence of conservatism properly asserted gives way to progressivism, which dismantles and degrades conservative values. Now, you might say, good riddance Victorian England, as I do, but the point I'm trying to make is we're stuck with Mill's philosophy but the social conditions have changed, and I think we need to move on. And so I think only a very deliberate attempt to strengthen our common life will do if we want to stem the tide of crashing birth rates, if we want to rid the epidemic of worklessness, if we want to control immigration. We must not be diffident about our conservatism and conservative values. And it's not hard, I don't think, to identify what these conservative values should be. In fact, the new coalition of conservative voters have told us 3 times they want their affections for family, commitment to country, love of nation to be honoured by government. The irony, of course, is that the values of this new coalition are not very new, especially in Britain. Family, community, nation, this simply reflects the old normative values consistently held by the plain person. The plain person is the person who partakes in everyday tasks that are necessary to sustain our common life together, like you and me caring for children or elderly relatives, learning new skills, etc. Such people, plain people, naturally enough hold to traditional values that secure rather than threaten their circumstances. A final word just on young people. I sit slightly outside of Laura's brackets, born in 93, but I get it. A final word about young people and the future. I suspect or suggest that Gen Z, I'm technically millennial, but I know these guys, might just be conservative. Current trends are very interesting, mainly cultural issues. Gen Z are watching less porn, they're taking less drugs, they're living cleaner and greener lives. And I think I know why. And I think it's because, and other panellists have touched on this, Gen Z are facing overwhelming and distressing economic uncertainty, and this is kind of driving a cultural conservatism among them. A lot of commentators talk about the economy and culture as if these are two different drivers or two different forces. Should the Conservative Party be right on culture and left on the economy, whatever that means? But I think they're inseparable, and I'll end here. There was an advert I saw on the Tube recently for plant-based sausages. And it said something like, appealing to Gen Z, you might not be able to buy a house, but could your parents buy plant-based sausages? And if you don't laugh, you cry, because it's that depressing. But it seems to me that young people are turning once again to timeless conservative values, perhaps trying to avoid risky behaviours because they face economic uncertainty with no capital underneath them or prospect of acquiring financial assets of any kind. So there you go. The future of conservatism is in the old new idea to strengthen the institutions of family, community, nation. These are the things that make the individual happy, safe and truly free. And this might look like the past, but in fact it's a stable, robust and resilient platform for a modernising reform agenda.
Thank you very much, Imogen. Brilliant. And I think we can all hope there could be a conservatism where you can buy a house and plant-based sausages. That is in the bounds of what we want to try and get to. Now, I'm going to open now to questions very quickly. We want to get as many of you as possible. But one thing, Michael, I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned the 2 great public service reforms last decade. One was education, free schools and academies, and the other was universal credit. When we look back on the last 13 years, do you think the country is more fundamentally conservative than it was now, and if not, why not? What should we think about the future, about the actual enactment of this stuff, as well as the principles?
I think that the country, in some respects, has been, Imogen set out a set of reasons why a particular group, cohort, generation might be more inclined towards conservative values overall. It resonated. I'm not of that generation, I think, visibly. No, I think the short answer is yes, but I think it's also the case that to answer your question properly requires a fine-grained analysis of where social opinion is on a variety of topics, some of which we might have an argument over whether or not they are genuinely conservative. Because as you can tell from the panel, even though there's broad consensus here, if I were to say that there is a broader sense of the need for an economic policy that includes everyone in our society. I think that is emphatically a more conservative position. But there might be some people in the Conservative Party who would take issue with that.
And Tom, can I just throw that question to you before we open it out to the audience?
Yeah, look, I think the reality is what we're seeing is a country that is moving in a conservative direction, because I think young people are in many ways more conservative. They express that by, if you're of Michael's and my vintage, the aspiration of people leaving school and university was to join large corporates, to enter graduate trainee schemes and things like that. Most of the schools I speak to now, the young people want to be entrepreneurs. They want to start their own businesses. They want to do things that are important to themselves, but also important to their community. And I think that's hugely empowering. One of the problems we've got, though, is not that they are not conservative, but sometimes we are not liberating them to appreciate their full talents. And this is one of those areas where I think we still have a way to go, despite having been in government for 13 years. If you look at, for example, where our savings are, and you think about what savings are supposed to be about, whether it's pensions or ordinary savings, savings and pensions are the ways in which old people invest in young people, and they're the ways in which young people transfer their energy to old people. That's all it is. It's a form of exchange. And yet so much of our savings now has gone into bonds. It's effectively a nationalisation of effort. As you see in the UK, our pensions industry has now got about 60% in bonds, about 40% in equities. If you look at somewhere like Canada or Australia, which have similar ideas of pension, it's 80-20, but the 80 is equities. And the difference there is that what you're seeing is living money, equities, money that hires people, that has ideas, that starts companies, that innovates, actually going into young people who are able to transfer it into product, into ideas, into effort, into energy. And what we've done instead at the moment is we've left too much of it tied up in bonds, which is dead money. Money to pay the state. Money waiting.
And I'm just going to contradict myself by actually throwing a question to Nick now, which was, why do you think this is such an inflection moment for conservatism? Because as I set out in the beginning, conservatism adapts to what's going on at that particular moment. So the conservatism, I think we'd all agree, of 2009 is not the one of 2023, and similarly going further back in history as well. But maybe it's because the Conservative Party is trying to head for a fifth general election victory, which would be historic, has never happened in the party's history before. Or is there something else? Like, why is this such a significant moment for conservatism?
Well, I think it's because it's a significant moment for the country. And there's a kind of coming together of very long-term weaknesses and challenges that we have as a country. The fact that our economy has become very unbalanced geographically, over-reliant on not just the city, but too few industries, that productivity is too low, that we haven't invested enough in our people, but we also haven't invested enough in our infrastructure. We're talking about these things over decades and decades, but that's been reinforced by things that are then happening incredibly quickly. So Laura just talked about AI and changing technology, but you think about the events of the time in which we've been empowered, maybe just before that as well. You've had the financial crash and the Great Recession that followed. You've had a global pandemic that shut down the economy and then reopened it and unleashed global inflation. You've got the worst war in Europe since Hitler, and what that's done for the provision of energy and also inflation. You've got all these things. Then you've got the rise of the East, the relative decline of the West, the relative decline of America. There's a lot more challenge in the world. All of these things, they sound like it's big and geopolitical, but they actually all have an effect on our own energy bills and on our own the pound in our pocket. So I think to me it's about these very long-term problems becoming more apparent at a time of successive crises, really.
Thank you. Right, we're going to open this out to the floor now. We've got 2 roving microphones, one there and one over here. When I used to be a journalist, I used to come to these fringe events to ask politicians questions. So I'm going to return the favour to journalists. Now start with this person here, and then we'll go for the person beside here. So straight ahead here. Oh, never mind. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Freddie Hayward from the New Statesman. Which part of the 2019 manifesto do you think Rishi Sunak best represents?
Thank you. And then just the gentleman here, please. Bell. There. Yeah.
We're here talking about the future of conservatism. One of those people who will surely be involved in the future is Kemi Badenoch, who said today that leaving the ECHR is something that definitely needs to be on the table, starting with the ministers, but everybody who wants to, but please starting with the ministers. Do you agree with Kemi Badenoch that leaving the ECHR is something that definitely needs to be on the table?
Thanks, Alex. Let me take those 2. Let's start with the ECHR. Michael, do you think it's something that should be on the table?
Keep every option open.
Thank you. That was quick and easy. Tom?
I'm always happy to listen to ideas. I'd like to have the solutions that go along with them. What is the alternative of the GFA for devolved assemblies and administrations? What does it mean for the various different agreements we've struck already that are underpinned by it? Look, I'm always happy to listen, but I would like to have some answers that go with it.
Laura?
Yeah, I'm just going to come in very briefly. I think it's always being raised in the context of the Rwanda decision, and I have enormous respect and admiration for Lord Reid and the 4 justices that will hear that case, and they haven't heard that case, and I just sort of always feel we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. But the one thing I would say on the European Court of Human Rights is there is also a question which is actually part of the dynamic that we have anyway with the court about the margin of discretion that any member state has over certain matters to which they apply their decision-making. And I think I'm one of the few Conservative MPs who's practiced seriously in human rights law, so I have a view on this. But when you look at their jurisprudence, sometimes they're dealing with signatory states where the human rights abuse is egregious and the applicant or the applicant's family, if they're not alive anymore, would have no recourse other than through that court. And other times you're dealing with very marginal issues. I could take it well out of anything to do with immigration, but maybe things like the standard of evidence that the police have obtained in an investigation or something. And it does engage questions sometimes about the margin of discretion that's afforded to states. And I just sometimes think we're sort of leapfrogging that, which is a really important question and dialogue and conversation that I think we'd want to have as a first.
Which is something Lord Sumption, I think, wrote about in The Spectator recently about that wider point. Now, on the 2019 manifesto, I'm going to give the people, Nick, the highlights of the 2019 manifesto and what Rishi Sunak represents from it.
The highlight for me was to control immigration, which hasn't really happened in the way that I'd have liked. I think Rishi actually embodies the spirit of the 2019 manifesto more than people think. One of the strange things about his leadership is, for example, he cut foreign aid spending and threw it at the NHS, which is probably the most sort of red wall friendly kind of populist thing you could do, and the party hasn't really talked about it.
Thank you. Imogen?
I'd say look at our fantastic levelling up agenda, fantastic levelling up secretary, and the long-term plan for towns announced today. Brilliant.
And it was brilliant because it was based on 2 fantastic bits of research
by
Onward that was cited in the paper. Tom?
Look, I think Rishi does exemplify a lot of what's in that manifesto. He's certainly demonstrated already in the past few weeks that drive and energy that the 2019 manifesto was supposed to deliver. And that ability to create innovation out of stasis, which is exactly what it was trying to do, is exactly what he's been doing. And, of course, he then also took the fantastically wise decision of hiring Will Tanner, which, of course...
Michael?
Well, there are still some aspects of the 2019 manifesto that I've got to deliver. So I've got to make sure that we do the Renters Reform Bill and also that we bring home the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions Bill. So Rishi appointed me to do that. So that's the remaining part of the mission.
And Laura?
Yeah, and I think I would probably say in education he seems to be embodying and accelerating really the spirit of what was in our manifesto on that with all his stuff on numeracy.
Thank you. Let's take some more questions, please. Let's go this side of the room. And can we go for... if you want to go like this, exactly. This row here, the gentleman here in the white shirt and the lady beside him.
Thank you very much, Tom Scottson from Politics Home. Do you think it's a threat to the future of conservatism that so few young people own their own home, and would you bring back mandatory housing targets?
I would take this other question, please.
You've talked a lot about how the next election will be a major test for the Conservatives, but there are more Conservative MPs standing down than at any recent election. Does this just suggest to you that there's maybe a lack of faith in the party or lack of unity over what the future of Conservatism actually is? Sorry, it was Ellen Langford from the iPaper.
Thank you very much. Michael, do you want to do the one about young people and home ownership and targets?
Yeah, I think there's a massive misunderstanding on the part of people about how our housing and planning system actually works. We've never had mandatory housing targets. It's always been the case that local authorities have been able to vary the amount that has been allocated through the objective assessment of housing need. It's simply been the case that the Planning Inspectorate has tended not to allow that variation to be bodied forth. It's also the case that people mix up the individual housing targets with local authorities are supposed to deliver with the 300,000 target overall, and they also forget the million target that we had in the manifesto that we're likely to meet. I don't blame people for getting these things wrong, because housing and planning policy, particularly planning policy, is fiendishly complicated. But one of the things that I do find bizarre is that people say that Labour are being brave or taking a reforming stance on housing policy. I haven't heard a single thing that they've said other than their desire, which they don't go into any detail on, to build on the Greenbelt as distinctive and different. And when they had an opportunity to support us when we were reforming the Habitats Directive in order to allow more houses to be built, they bottled it. They were blockers, not builders. To take one step back, do we need to build more homes? Absolutely. But again, if you're going to look at what's happening in the housing market, one needs to appreciate, as I know you do, the impact of inflation and increases in interest rates on mortgage payments and rents. And you also need to look at why there is resistance in some communities to new development. And you need to ensure that new development is beautiful, that infrastructure accompanies it, that people feel they have a sense of democratic ownership and control, that the environmental externalities are addressed, and that new building is comes in the form of neighbourhoods and not just dormitories. And critically, in the long-term plan for housing that we unveiled in July, we had a fully comprehensive plan for not just meeting but potentially exceeding the targets that we already have in developing new homes. And Labour have done nothing to match it. I find one of the, most curious aspects of current political conversation, the idea that Labour are radical on housing. It is a chimera. It is a nonsense. And it is time that Labour were held to account for the gap between the rhetoric that Keir Starmer unveiled at the CBI and the reality of how he votes. He ordered his peers in the House of Lords to make common cause with the Duke of Wellington to stop people having new homes. Now, obviously, allying with the Duke of Wellington made sense in 1815, but in 2023, there was an opportunity for him there to provide more new homes for the next generation, but he joined with that champion of the oppressed, His Grace Charles Wellesley, and you had this alliance of the great estates and the great hypocrite. So the challenge to you, Tom, and to everyone else is to ask Keir Starmer, why do you side with dukes against the next generation? That is the challenge.
Well, thankfully there's Labour Party conference next week at which you can ask that very question. Now, this thing about younger people, we've done research at Onward on millennials in particular, which is my generation, who are the first generation in history to not become more right-wing as they get older. And that's due to home ownership, it's due to jobs, it's due to family. And we argued at Onward that is a massive problem for the Conservative Party, because in 10, 15 years' time, they are the next natural Conservative voting base. And that does need to be tackled. So I'm worried about it. Laura and Tom, are you worried about it?
Yeah, look, I think I am. Look, I was rather impressed by the amazing joint effort of General de Gaulle and Harold Macmillan on my right there, delivering not only a direct assault on the Duke of Wellington, but a pledge of 300,000 homes. It was a very impressive double act in one person. And as usual, Michael got to the heart of it, which is that making sure we have the homes, making sure we have the radical investment in homes is exactly the danger that we've got, because people find it very hard to have a stake in a community if they don't have part of that community, if they're not part of an established community. If you're moving, if you're renting and you're moving every few years, it's very hard to lay down roots, and that's part of the challenge that you're talking about. It is quite noticeable, though, just to go back to the Labour point, that the places where Labour has had the chance, where it really has been tested as to whether it's going to build or not, whether it's going to innovate in the new housing solutions that actually are now available because architecture has advanced, engineering has advanced, and actually place has changed. They haven't done it. Sadiq Khan's done nothing. Andy Burnham's done nothing. These are absolute failures in areas where houses could be built in large numbers for young people who actually want them. So I think there is a huge opportunity for us to do more. But I think you're right that the challenge of making sure that young people have the same stake in society that old people do is incredibly alive.
And Laura, briefly, and ideally, I think it doesn't mention housing.
Yeah, well, I do think that I think I don't want to just repeat the word social media, but I think that there is a sort of dominant narrative across the internet that characterises the left as good and the right as evil, and I think that has had an impact. I definitely see it when I go on school visits. I also think, just one of Michael's points a moment ago about the lie about them being the party of house building, I do think in some ways it must be a weakness on ours. We're not sufficiently challenging some of Labour's narrative. If I could take another policy area, education, I can't think of a single education policy they have other than the Breakfast Club policy. They all stood on a manifesto of abolishing Ofsted, stopping SATs. When we had the first lockdown, the NEU sent a list of requirements to all the schools in the United Kingdom, about 150 requirements, treating children like they were nuclear bombs rather than, having the desire to get back into school. And Labour supported that.
Yeah.
So I find it mystifying. Michael has more to say.
No, on this. Okay. There are lots of really gifted political journalists in this room. I want anyone here who is a political journalist to answer me this question. Apart from a tax, okay, we know they want a tax. Name a single Labour policy to improve state education. Okay? Is there anything?
We'll take that silence as no, and then get some final questions in before this panel comes over. Could we just get here and here on the front row, please? Actually, we'll try and get three in. So 1, 2, and we'll get the gentleman here, please. Thank you.
Hello, Aubrey Alagressi from The Guardian. I just wanted to get a little bit more clarity on the ECH point, if that wasn't too much to ask. Mr. Gove, I think you said you were keep every option open, and Mr. Tugendhat, you said you were happy to listen to options. I mean, there are cabinet ministers who are currently advocating this, so can you both be clear whether or not you support it or not? Leaving the ECHR, that is.
Gentleman behind.
Thank you very much. The great policy of the 1980s was the sale of council houses. It was a huge vote winner. What's the comparable policy of the 2020s?
It's a really good question. Thank you. And we had one more question to the gentleman just here. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Left-wing bias in the education system right the way through to post-grad level. We now have groups like Stonewall and Black Lives Matter, etc., taking charge of corporate policy. I see these as real threats to future conservatism, because the conservative message is being tarnished, tarred and sneered at continually by these organisations.
Thank you. Now, do you want to say any more on the ECHR question with Aubrey's question there for Michael?
No. I made my position crystal clear.
And Tom, anything else you'd like to add to that?
I was hoping that Aubrey was going to answer the question on policy, but I'm afraid I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you. Now, on this question, Nick, we just heard there about institutions and how they're influenced by pressure groups there. Now, we have seen some pushback in Whitehall against that kind of cultural impact there. What do you think can be done about it?
Well, I mean, I think sometimes Conservatives say, why is this Quango behaving in this particular way? We're a Conservative government, and the state shouldn't be advancing non-Conservative ideals in this kind of way. And then they say, well, why don't we get a Tory to chair it? As if that's likely to be the solution. And actually what you tend to find is when Tories chair these bodies, it's actually quite difficult to grip it. It might be welcome that there are Conservatives in some of these positions, but you're not going to change the entire culture, especially in a sort of public sector organisation like that, with the identity of one chair. And I think we have to look at the reasons why lots of people in the public sector try to behave in these kinds of ways, and to some extent we're still operating under the big macro legal frameworks established by the last Labour government, whether that's the Equality Act, whether it's the Human Rights Act. If you want to know why the police, for example, appear to be behaving in woke fashion, to use a word that will soon be banned, I think it's so overused. If police officers have to go through, like endless checkpoints and internal policies to make sure they're sort of meeting certain equality impact assessments, or if they're sort of considering the human rights of everybody, they might stop on the street before they think about the rights of the people they're actually protecting by stopping those suspects on the street. This isn't an argument for no safeguards, of course. I'm an advocate for the reform of things like stop and search. But if you do that, then it's little wonder that these organisations lose sight of their core purpose. So I think we need to be much more ambitious on the legal frameworks that affect the culture of these organisations.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to take your questions and put this to the panel as a final summing up, because you are right that the right to buy council house was completely transformative for a whole generation of people. I think a lot... Oh, sorry, Charlie, pointing in the wrong direction, thank you. But I would like everyone on the panel to either say what they think that is now and what it could be going into the next Parliament, and put that nice small question, Imogen, to start off with.
Okay. Michael's done some fantastic work on community land trusts. We need more of them. We need them to be accessible, people to be able to engage with them. We need a massive expansion of them and to make them work for normal people that want a nice house and a nice place.
Thank you.
I think the most immediate thing that we can do to emulate, though it doesn't match the scale, is leasehold reform. For all those people who bought homes thinking they could own them, but in fact only have leases, and in many cases are being bilked by private equity gangsters who've acquired the freehold, we need to liberate them from that. So that's the most immediate thing. More broadly, I think bringing beauty back into people's lives by creating wonderful and beautiful spaces that draw on our architectural histories and traditions. So I think the thing that we should do is have the vision to create the Nash terraces of the future, and to have the same sort of spirit that Haussmann brought to Paris in the 19th century.
Laura?
Yeah, I like that. I think one of the things that I've enjoyed learning about most as an MP is the skills revolution, and seeing people who might have been channeled into degree courses that weren't worth doing and wouldn't have taken them anywhere, developing really strong skills bases and having highly successful careers. There's lots of that in my constituency, and it's so different from how things were 20 years ago.
Thank you. Tom?
So I think the two elements, if I may, are going to be, one, we need to look at releasing public land to build on it, whether that's giving free access to railway lines and motorways so that engineers can come up with great ideas to actually construct on top of public infrastructure. And the second is we need to release capital. We need to find ways to make sure that that dead money that I was talking about is turned into live money, hires people, and liberates an entire generation. After all, if we want people to, as the Bible says, go forth and multiply, I believe, Danny, then we need to give them the space to do it.
Danny did not write that particular element of the Bible, I don't think. And Nick?
So I completely agree about council house sales in the 80s. That policy was brilliant on its own terms, but also because it encapsulated what Margaret Thatcher was doing at a time where the state had become overmighty, and the vested interests connected to the state, in particular some of the trade unions and the kind of corporatist policies that were pursued at the time, were ruining the country. So it was brilliant in the specificity of the policy and as a symbol of the general. Where are the vested interests today? What are the things that are holding back the country, including with house building? Actually, a lot of those vested interests now lie in broken markets, and I know how passionate Michael is when it comes to reforming the house building sector and the market for the construction companies. And that, I think, is the big mission for Conservatives in the future. Take on those vested interests, even if they're in the private sector. We can change the shapes of markets to make them work for people.
And finally, I'm going to add my own thing into this, taking chair's prerogative, which is actually picking on your point, Nick, about vested interests and how institutions work. We still have not thought enough about how Whitehall and the British state does operate. That I think if we were to look back on where we're going to the future of conservatism, it's to have a clearer-eyed, more ambitious idea about how we can get the state to deliver better. Because I don't think any of us would say the state needs more money or is too small, but at the moment it's not working as effectively as it could. And that is hard, requires a lot of thinking, but that in itself can lead to so many better outcomes over everything that we deliver. Well, I don't know how to begin to sum up all that, but I'd say in people who look at the Conservative Party and say, it's all finished, it's all over, look at this panel. Look at the amazing ideas we've had in terms of building, in terms of pension reforms, in terms of housing, in terms of culture, in terms of family. It's all there, ladies and gentlemen. So I want to thank you so much for coming to this first event from our Future Conservatism Paper 1, which, as I said, is coming out next week. So you can read it, ingest it. There's a brilliant foreword written by Michael, which will be out with the paper, defining some of these ideas. And we are continuing to do our monthly Future of Conservatism debates at the Unheard Club in London. So do come along to those if you're interested. And please give a big round of applause to everyone on my panel. Thanks for their time. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Is that microphone on? Yes, it is. We can hear. Hello, everyone. We're going to get started now. If everyone would like to take their seats for this in conversation with the Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable James Cleverly. Now, if you were in the last session, I'm Sebastian Payne. I'm Director of Onward. And I was trying to think how long I've known you, James, but it's probably longer than either of us care to remember. It was probably 2015, I would say, when you first became the Conservative MP for Braintree.
Yeah. I'm now getting to the stage where I don't lie about my age. I now get to the stage where I lie about how long I've known people, because that's the giveaway of my ever progressing years. So yeah.
Well, we're here to talk about your current role as Foreign Secretary, which you have been in for just about a year now, and we've been quite a few occupants of the Foreign Office over the past couple of years, as with some other government departments as well. You were briefly Education Secretary last summer.
I was glorious. That was my, I think, short but glorious time. 9 weeks. 9 weeks of education.
What was the highlight of that 9 weeks?
Genuinely getting through the A-level exam results day pretty much unscathed.
With no rogue algorithms.
With no rogue algorithms, and it was it was. You can imagine the whole year building up to this. I turn up and they say, "Oh, in a couple of weeks' time, Secretary of State, you'll be personally held responsible for the education results of tens of thousands of young people." And I went, "But I've only just arrived." It's like, well, comes with the job. But we did it. But thanks to my predecessors. I'd like to claim credit, but my predecessors deserve credit.
But you moved on swiftly from there to become Foreign Secretary. Now, you've been there, said, about a year now. What's been your biggest surprise and your biggest lesson from the Foreign Office?
I suppose one of the advantages that I had, having been a minister in the department before becoming Secretary of State in the department, there were fewer things that were complete surprises. There are a couple of things that I can't talk about in detail. There's some nasty surprises when you get taken up to the room where you have the very, very secure briefings, and the big ring binder of scary truths gets unveiled to you, the kind of things that only the Foreign Secretary is allowed to know. That can be quite...
Were you prepared for that? Because you must have known in your head the ring binder of doom existed.
Yeah, and look, I'd previously been the Minister for Middle East, North Africa, so a lot of the things about the threats, about the work that we have to do to keep British people safe both at home and abroad, I was aware of a lot of those things. When you actually see how much time, and I'm unapologetically proud of our intelligence and security services, because when you see how much work they do keeping us safe, that most people will never know about and they'll never get the credit for, and they do it certainly not for the money. They do it for the love of their country and the importance of the job. When you see just how much they do on our behalf, it really is quite humbling.
So I thought we'd do a quick tour of the world, much like your travel schedule, of some of the countries and issues you've dealt with since you became Foreign Secretary. Of course, top of that list has to be the war in Ukraine, and obviously some of that falls under the purview of the Defence Secretary. But in a diplomatic sense, what have you learned in your year as Foreign Secretary with regards to Ukraine and where things will develop in the coming months ahead?
Well, one of the things that really, really struck me when I visited Ukraine, and I spoke to the Ukrainians, and not just the political leadership, but when I spoke to ordinary Ukrainians, people that ran restaurants, people that had just very, very ordinary businesses, the thing that I am now more certain of than ever before is they are not going to stop fighting until they have got their country back. And all these lazy voices that say, oh, if the UK or if the West stopped arming Ukraine, the war would be over. That is nonsense. This war finishes when the Russians leave and not until. The Ukrainians will stick with it. And we promised them that we would stick with them until they got their country back, which is why and I know the PM is on the same page as this, and the Defence Secretary and the Cabinet, we are absolutely determined to keep supporting them until they regain their country, because they are not going to stop. And I met a bar owner, a boyfriend, girlfriend, and they ran a bar in Kyiv, and they run the bar at weekends, and during the week they shut up the bar, and then they go down to the line of contact and they volunteer as battlefield medics during the week, and then they go back to Kyiv to run their business 3 nights a week to fund their volunteering as battlefield medics. They've been doing this now for months and months and months, and they are determined. And when you see that level of determination, it's inspiring, but it also, as I say, reinforces my belief that they are going to stick with it until the job is done, and therefore we have to stick with them.
And just on the slightly thorny issue, though, when you say want their country back, of course, there is the question of, is it pre-2014 borders when we think about Crimea? Because President Zelensky has been pretty clear in all of his public statements that that does include Crimea. But in terms of the UK's position and how you see it, what's your feel on that? Because they're two quite separate things.
So I feel that our position has really got to be defined by Ukraine's position. I don't think we have the right, I don't think any of us have the right to start dictating to other countries how much of their country they should give away in order that we can, move on to other important issues. I don't think we would take kindly if someone were to do that to us, and so I'm not going to start doing that to the Ukrainian leadership. The bottom line is that the nature of any peace settlement has got to rightly be a decision for the Ukrainian political leadership, because they're the ones that are going to have to justify any decisions to the Ukrainian people. And I'm not going to start turning around to the Ukrainians and saying, you should do this, you should do that, you shouldn't do the other. That really is for them.
Now, from Ukraine, hopping to the other side of the Atlantic and America, because that is going to play quite a big role next year, because we've got, I think, the first year since 1964 where we're likely to have a UK election and American election in the same year. And it was, of course, LBJ in America, and Harold Wilson won that election here. There is, if the polls are correct, a very good chance President Trump will win that election if it was held tomorrow. We'll see what happens in the campaign. But he is taking a very different view on Ukraine. And there is a challenge for the UK there, because if he was to win and return to the White House again and either try to cut some kind of deal with Vladimir Putin, which he's talked about in several interviews, or was to significantly withdraw spend or effort, that would leave the UK in a bit of a pickle, because a lot of our military aid is piggybacked off America.
Look, we've been ahead of the curve throughout on this, and we have defined our position because of our values. So when my predecessors, when the Prime Minister's predecessors decided to train the Ukrainian armed forces after the invasion of Crimea, we were ahead of the pack internationally. When we decided to donate anti-tank missiles, we're ahead of the pack internationally. When Ben Wallace, the Prime Minister, and I met over Christmas to decide what our posture was going to be towards Ukraine in 2023, we decided that we would donate main battle tanks prior to any other country in the world. We decided that we would commit to training fast jet pilots before anyone else in the world. We committed to donate those long-range missiles, Storm Shadow missiles, before anyone else in the world. And we did that because we believed it to be the right thing to do. And on each of those files, we have led the world. And the point, and I've said this to the Americans, that we will do what we believe to be right. And we have made a commitment to continue to support the Ukrainians. Now, they can join in or they can watch us do it, but it is going to happen. And the point that I've also made is that we should be very, very thoughtful about the message that we send to the world, because every potential aggressor, despot, and dictator is watching how we respond to this situation in Ukraine. And we've got a choice in terms of the message that we send. We can either send the message that when we commit to something, we mean it and we stick with it until the job is done, or we can send the message that we've got about 18 months, 24 months worth of patience, and if you're willing to be aggressive for long enough, you get to win. And that second message is not one that we should be pumping out into the world. The world will become an infinitely more dangerous place if we buckle at this point. So it is in our interest, not just the Ukrainians, in our national interest and in the US national interest to stick with it. Because if we don't, we're just going to have to revisit this anyway, and it'll be more expensive, more painful, and more bloody if we don't resolve it now.
And with regards to that American election, obviously, I'm not expecting to say who you would like to win, but how does the prospect of Donald Trump returning to the White House make you feel?
Well, look, we've worked bilaterally with a Trump-led White House, and we make it work. I mean, the bottom line is we always make it work. The United States of America is one of our closest and most important allies in the world. We respect the decision in a mature, high-functioning democracy. We respect the decision made by the voters of that country, and whoever they choose to be their next president, we will make sure that relationship works. Because when the UK and the US are working together, the world is a healthier, wealthier, safer place. If wedges can be driven between our two countries, that will not be to the best interest of the UK, will not be to the best interests of the United States of America. And the kind of countries, the kind of leadership that would advocate a US-America split do not have our best interests at heart. So we will work with whoever the American people choose.
Now, to hop back on your proverbial plane and go all the way over now to China, as you actually did as Foreign Secretary, which was quite a moment, because there's obviously relations between the West and China, but the UK in particular have been pretty icy for some time now. Was it your decision to make that trip, and do you think it was a success?
Yes and yes. Now, I would caveat that second yes by saying we've got to be realistic about what you can achieve on any one bilateral meeting like that. We haven't had a foreign secretary go to China, I think if I'm right, for about 5 years. I think if my maths is correct. But the bottom line is China is large, it is wealthy, it is influential, it behaves on the international stage in ways that we feel need to change, which means that we have to engage with China. And sometimes the language that we use around foreign relations, I think is awkward. So we talk about engagement, we talk about having a diplomatic relationship with another country, and sometimes that makes it sound as if this was a kind of, a cozy cup of tea and a nice chit chat over dim sum or a slice of cake. That's not what international relations is about. International relations is about getting stuff done. Not necessarily instantly, but it's about getting stuff done.
Would you say that's your defining characteristic about the foreign secretary, of getting stuff done?
Look, that's what I try to focus on. I've always said we should be a results-orientated department. One of the things that I have a real bee in my bonnet about, and when I started saying this, I think the department chuckled, thinking it was a bit of an affectation. I hate the phrase "deeply concerned," and and I tell
of course, you never hear that in the Foreign Office.
Well,
at all.
Not anymore. You don't. No, seriously, there was someone highlighted to me actually just a couple of days ago. There's a Twitter feed. Don't do it now. I don't want you distracted. There's a Twitter feed called "Is the EU Concerned?" And basically, it is a repository of all the statements that gets made that says the EU is concerned. The EU is very concerned by. The EU is deeply concerned by. The EU is extremely concerned by. It's this big stream of statements about how concerned we are about things. And we used to do that a lot in the UK. And I made the point, I don't want people to know how I feel. I want people to know what we do. So we're either deeply concerned enough to do something, in which case let's tell people what we're doing. And if we choose not to do something, maybe it's because we weren't really deeply concerned, and therefore we should probably not claim that we were. So it's about getting stuff done. That trip to China was not because I was deeply concerned about Chinese behavior. It was because I was trying to change Chinese behavior, both bilaterally, regionally, and within China's borders itself. Now, as I say, I'm not naive. You don't just have one robust conversation and expect a country like China to suddenly change its behaviors. But if you don't engage, if you don't eyeball people, if you don't sit across the table and make it clear what we regard as acceptable and unacceptable behaviours, both bilaterally and more generally, then you are not going to be able to make change. And just saying nasty things about a country on Twitter, that's not how foreign affairs actually makes a difference. And I'm here to make a difference.
And are you at all concerned? 'Cause obviously some of your...
I'm not deeply concerned.
Some of your colleagues back at home, Conservative MPs, take a very different view of that. They are very happy to take hardline positions, in newspapers and on media, on Twitter about China. And some of them were quite critical of your trip there, saying that actually this is showing that we're kowtowing and that we've gone back to the golden era that we saw in a previous government, even though the geopolitical context has changed. What would you say to those people?
Look, some of the people that have been saying that are people who are being sanctioned by the Chinese state. So I get why they're so angry about this.
Are you sanctioned by the Chinese state?
I don't think so. I'm not sure. I don't think so. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to go.
Your spin doctor is shaking his head, so we'll take that as a no then.
Not yet.
After this, he will be.
I'm not going to take it too personally if people who are currently being sanctioned by the Chinese state have a very firm position on this. I get it. I don't agree with their position, but I get it. But the point I've made is that we have influence in the UK. We have leverage, even with a country as big and as wealthy and as powerful as China, and I intend to use it. And if I don't engage with that country, then I'm not utilising all the tools at my disposal. And as I say, it's about getting stuff done. And look, there's often contradictions in their position. So I've had people say, don't talk to the Chinese government, don't engage with Chinese ministers. And then in the next breath saying, you must raise the case of Jimmy Lai. And I'm like, well, hang on, I have to talk to them to raise the case of this individual, so I'm going to talk to them. Again, situations where people say, a UK minister visiting China is kowtowing and a demonstration of weakness. But also, if a Chinese minister visits the UK, what's that? Is that them kowtowing and showing weakness to us? I mean, your argument either works in both directions or it doesn't work at all. The bottom line is visiting each other's countries, having meetings, having those discussions. That is my job, and I intend to do it.
And this is the last question on China. Of course, during this period, we have seen the alleged Chinese spy working in the Houses of Parliament. And, I don't want to expect you to comment on that particular case because there's obviously ongoing proceedings there. But in terms of the general penetration of our democracy by China, that we know that Russia has sought to try and hack and bias and change things, do you think China should be regarded in the same way as Russia in terms of of our political system?
Well, I'm not going to talk about any individual country, but we have security services for a reason. Those fantastic people that work for MI5 exist for a reason. If foreign governments weren't trying to penetrate our democracy, penetrate our society, if they weren't trying to infiltrate, and if they weren't trying to spy on us, we wouldn't need MI5. It exists for a reason. We have incredibly professional people within that organisation for a reason. So it shouldn't be a surprise that the UK, because we are influential on the world stage, because we are a major democracy, because we have voice, because we have leverage, we of course will be the target of overseas espionage and attempted penetration. We shouldn't be surprised by that. I'm not going to go as far as say we should wear it as a badge of honour, but it is a reflection of the fact that we matter on the world stage, and countries try to influence us. There's a good way and there's a bad way. Diplomacy, the kind of international lobbying that we all do, that's the appropriate way. And we defend ourselves against inappropriate attempts to influence.
Right, we're getting back on your plane now and going to Brussels at this point, because during your period as Foreign Secretary, we've had two notable agreements struck with the EU. One was the Windsor Framework with regards to the Northern Ireland Protocol, and then the second, of course, was the associate membership of Horizon that was negotiated a couple of weeks ago there. It's very interesting that obviously we are outside the bloc now. We've done these bespoke deals at this point, and it's an approach that this government is doing, but also the Labour Party are also talking about as well. And we saw Sir Keir Starmer talking about some kind of returns deal. Do you think essentially you could say we were in the EU but a bit out? Whatever happens, are we going to end up out but a bit in?
Under a Conservative government, we are remaining outside the European Union.
Out.
Fact, out. Like Mickey Flanagan, out. I see a lot of you don't watch stand-up comedy. Okay. So there's a big difference between negotiating with a near neighbour and an important set of relationships, both the EU institutions and the nation states with the EU, in the best interests of the UK, and basically the capitulation that we would inevitably see with the Labour Party. So, like everyone will have had their own motivations for voting for Brexit. So I wrote an open letter with a number of colleagues, 2015 intake, in January of 2016. Basically saying that we've looked at what Prime Minister Cameron was asking for in terms of renegotiation with the EU, and even if he got everything he asked for, we didn't think it was going to be enough, and therefore, with a heavy heart, we would be voting to leave the European Union. And I was told by someone who I respect enormously that my political career was over. And for those people who had been campaigning to leave the European Union for decades, of course, their position was priced in. I'd only just got elected.
It's quite like Rishi Sunak, who was
funnily enough,
the same thing.
Funnily enough, another person whose career was going to be destroyed by the fact he came out publicly for Brexit as a 2015 intaker was Rishi Sunak. I can't remember what happened to him, but I did all right. But the point is, for those people who'd been campaigning on this for years publicly, their Brexit vote was priced in. But there are a number of us, including the Prime Minister, including myself, who basically did what we believed to be right, even though we were told it would destroy our political careers. And so when I say that in this job now, when I make sure that we have a pragmatic working relationship with the EU that allows our businesses to trade with the EU as easily as possible, but without getting sucked into the single market, without getting sucked into the customs union, I believe my credentials are copper-bottomed.
Have you ever, even in your darkest moments, ever regretted your Brexit vote?
No, not even slightly. Not once. Look, when I first became minister in the department, I flew out to the Middle East. No, in fact, funnily enough, my first trip as a minister in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, as it were, before the merger, was to the Munich Security Conference. So the first trip I made on the day after I was appointed was to Munich. And I had a series of meetings with representatives of governments in the Middle East, which was my new patch. And over and over and over again, they were saying, brilliant, the Brits are back. You're engaging with us again. I watched a documentary that was shot I think it was in '98, and it was called How to Be the Foreign Secretary.
Michael Cockerell.
It was, exactly. And it had Robin Cook being the new shiny Labour Foreign Secretary. And one of the things that really struck me is he was talking about his monthly 2-day trip to Brussels for EU foreign ministers meetings. 2 days trip, 2 days every month. Now you said that I've done, in my first year in the job, I did 58 international visits. That would have been impossible if I had to weave in a monthly pilgrimage to Brussels. I just would not have been able to have that amount of contact with interlocutors around the world. I would not have gone to Latin America. I would not have been the first foreign secretary since they became independent to visit the Solomon Islands. And you might think, well, does it really matter if no one's been to the Solomon Islands since they become independent? Well, the fact they're in the process of building a Chinese harbour that will accept Chinese military ships yes, I think it's really important that we hadn't visited that country for decades. And the sad truth is there are lots of places I go to where people said, oh, you're the first foreign secretary since, this person back in Margaret Thatcher's time. That's just unacceptable. We have to have a global presence, and you can't have a global presence if you spend half your working life pinging backwards and forwards to Brussels, as lovely, although rainy, as Brussels is.
Now, finally, I'm going to bring your plane back to Westminster and ask you about a couple of domestic things here. So, first of all, I want to ask you about something I don't think you've talked that much about, which is Scotland. Because at the moment, obviously, Scotland has gone through something of a change of leadership, shall we say, over the past year while you've been in this job as well. And the prospects for that are important because the fact is the United Kingdom on the world stage is about a united kingdom. Yes. It's about the nations bound together, working together, and for a long period you've had in Scotland a country that has not been as tightly working together as it could have been. How do you see that developing, particularly with regards to the election next year, when a lot of people are expecting a potential a collapse in the SNP, like when I make a cheese souffle and it comes out the oven, which might benefit some parties but not necessarily the Conservatives? So
I have a huge amount of admiration. I'm a bit of a man crush, I have to say, on Scotland's Foreign Secretary. He's a tall, charming, good-looking guy. It's me. It's me. So I am Scotland's Foreign Secretary. I am as passionate about promoting Scotland on the world stage as I am about promoting any other part of the United Kingdom, and I do so regularly. Whether it's investment opportunities in Scotland, whether it's renewable energy opportunities in Scotland, whether it's Scotch whisky, and I don't want to reinforce stereotypes, but incredibly popular on the world stage. So I am Scotland's Foreign Secretary. International relations is a devolved matter, and I do know that Angus Robertson, who I like personally, is trying very, very hard to pretend to be Scotland's Foreign Secretary. He's not. I've told him that, and because clearly I was unambiguous when I said, you will not pretend to be an independent nation on the world stage if you're going to rely on my civil servants to facilitate meetings for you. Clearly that was not clear enough. I find myself now in a position where once again I'm going to have to write to the Scottish Government to say it's really very simple. Foreign affairs is a reserved matter. I am Scotland's Foreign Secretary. You will not abuse the professionalism of my civil servants, and until you get your head around that, we are not going to be able to facilitate foreign meetings where you're promoting separatism. The UK is one whole. It is an amazing country and every bit of it is amazing. I promote every bit of the UK all the time, and I'm proud and passionate about doing so. And the point I would say about Scotland, particularly as they head towards a general election where their record in government will be put under the microscope, rather than pretending to have a separate foreign policy, I would suggest the SNP were better served at dealing with the public services on which Scottish people rely. So I feel very, very strongly about this. I live in Scotland. I love Scotland. It has so much to offer on the world stage as part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Now, one big topic that's dominating a Westminster debate is the ECHR, and we've heard several of your colleagues, including Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch, saying departure should be an option on the table. Do you agree with her? Well, I get the frustration with sometimes activist judges. I would purely make the observation that just as France makes fantastic wine, but increasingly now we make some brilliant wine. Make some brilliant wine in Essex. So a lot of things that are wonderful overseas, we are able to produce here in the UK. And left-wing activist judges, we've got quite a few of those in the UK. And so one of the points I make is that as a government, you have to deal you have to deal with the judicial system, and were it not the ECHR, I'm sure we would have domestic judges that were trying to prevent us discharging our duty to the British people. We have to deal with that. I do, however, feel, and I've said this in speeches, the speech I made to the Chatham House think tank, a lot of the institutions, a lot of the agreements that were put in place in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War are in many instances now 70 plus years old, and we need to make sure that they remain relevant for the modern world. And I've said that about the United Nations, I've said that about the World Bank. So it is right that we look at making sure these things are right for the modern world. It is also right we break the model of these evil people smuggling gangs. Now, border control is rightly a job for the Home Office, but we work very closely with the Home Office to make sure the countries on the routes that the people traffickers use, we are trying to interdict and interrupt and break their business model at every single state. That's the part of the equation the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office lead on, and we work very, very closely with them and will continue to do so. So I think we can break the model without necessarily needing to leave the ECHR. And the point that strike me is that we're actually doing really quite effective work on this. So, for example, Albanian small boat arrivals down 90%, 90%.
After the deal was struck.
After the deal that we came to with Albania.
So maybe Keir Starmer's right, and you need to do a deal with Brussels. Then is that what you're saying?
Well, no. What I'm saying is you need Conservatives doing the negotiation, because negotiation isn't just turning up and asking for stuff; it's actually cutting deals. And the UK, as I say, is doing better than our European neighbours on this. So, as I say, Albanian small boat arrivals down 90%. Small boat arrivals this year down 20%. Compare that with arrivals in Italy, which are up 50%. Illegal migration across Europe up 30%. So the European numbers are trending in the wrong direction. The UK numbers are heading in the right direction because of the tough decisions that we are making across government.
Now, finally, we're going to throw out to questions in a moment, but the last thing I just wanted to ask you is, I believe you're the first non-white Foreign Secretary to hold that position, and there's been a lot of debate over the past week about has multiculturalism failed? What's your take on that?
Well, it's quite striking. One of the things about my job is I get to look back at the UK as other countries view us. And there are lots of countries around the world that have many, many decades or indeed centuries of migration, often far more than the UK has done. And yet we somehow are unique in the UK, that the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, the Trade Secretary, and others. I shouldn't have started a list because you always forget people, which is embarrassing. But many of the top seats around the government table are occupied by people whose heritage is not from these islands. And the reason I think we have been uniquely successful is because of our attitude towards integration and making sure that the people who've come to this country, chosen to make their homes in this country through legitimate and legal means, are properly integrated, feel part of society, learn the language and mix, I think is one of our great strengths. One of the things that does worry me is sometimes this well-intentioned but erroneous trend towards compartmentalization, to like this kind of separation thing. And I think we should celebrate what brings us together. And you know, diversity matters. I'm a rugby player, and I say, you know, if everyone on the rugby pitch was the same size and shape, you wouldn't be a successful team. Diversity works, but not some tokenism diversity, genuine diversity of thought, of background, but also, like a rugby team, despite the diversity, you're fundamentally playing by the same set of rules and pulling in the same direction. That has been a really successful model to the UK, and I think it's something that is absolutely well worth protecting and championing. And I do fear this, as I say, potential trend towards compartmentalization, isolating ethnic groups within society, which I think would be a terrible, terrible error.
Well, that was a very quick and rapid romp through your year as Foreign Secretary. I'm sure many others have questions. Have we got some roving microphones here? I'm going to start as a couple of journalists in the room, and I know from my past life that journalists love to come to think tank events to ask politicians questions. So do we have any journalists who want to ask any questions? We've got Stephen down here and Luke beside him. We just take these two questions together, thank you. And Callum is busying his way down there. Thank you very much.
Castle from the New York Times. On Ukraine, I think you said earlier this year that it was vital that this didn't become a war of attrition because that was what Putin wanted. Would you accept that it now has become a war of attrition? And if so, what are the implications? And also, if I could ask you in terms of Western unity, I mean, you talked a little bit about the United States. How are you concerned, or perhaps even deeply concerned, about European unity, and in particular what happened in the elections in Slovakia?
Do we take two questions and I'll come back on both, or one each?
You've pretty much covered what I was going to ask. It's Luke McGee from CNN.
Yeah.
You said foreign policy doesn't take place on Twitter, but to extend on what Stephen just said, there's a fairly well-known former US president, possible future US president, who did a lot of his on Twitter. When you meet our allies, do you sense any nervousness about having someone so erratic back in the White House at an institutional level? Because, of course, Theresa May had to pretty much encourage Trump to go on the record and say he wouldn't defund NATO. So I just wondered if, when you speak to our allies, if you sense any of this nervousness.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So with regard to the situation in Ukraine, obviously the preferred option would have been a fast and decisive victory for the Ukrainians. The truth of the matter is the Russian military spent the winter ahead of the spring counteroffensive digging in trench systems, laying mines, putting up tank traps and physical barriers. They made it a highly non-permissive environment for manoeuvrist warfare, which has meant it has become a much more attritional conflict. That is not what any of us would have wanted, because attritional wars are slow and they are bloody. So it's not the preferred option. However, the Ukrainians are still winning. So even with those physical defences, even with the Russians digging in so hard over the winter, the Ukrainians are still gaining ground. We must never lose sight of that. We would prefer that they would win quickly, but the second best option is that they win slowly, and they are winning slowly. Now, it means that we have to be more patient. It means our resilience has to last longer. What it doesn't mean is that we should ditch them at this point, for all the reasons that I've explained. And with regard to a future President Trump, I mean, he was a president, I think, unlike any former US president, so never served in a political appointment, never served in the US military. So he was a very, very different style of US president. And when we first started working with him, I think the whole world was unused to dealing with him. But we've seen him work for 4 years. And so his unpredictability is a bit more predictable, if you know what I mean. So, as I said to Seb, you know, we will make our relationship with the elected head of the United States of America work. And whether that's a future President Trump or President Biden second term or whatever permutation might come about, we will make that relationship work because it's in our global interest to make it work. And with regard to countries in Europe, this war has put huge strain on all of us. And actually, the closer you are to the conflict in terms of geography, the greater the strain, the number of Ukrainian refugees, the economic impact. And I get it's not easy, but we do have to stick with it. And this is a conversation I have in the States, in Europe. And I also make the point to leaders in the developing world when they say, look, this is not our problem, this is your problem, but we're feeling the pain. I make the point to them that actually it's all of our problems, because defending the UN Charter is really important for those smaller countries around the world who perhaps don't have the strength of arms to defend themselves against attack. Their best shield is a well-enforced UN Charter. And Russia has attempted to smash that, and we have a duty to prevent them doing so.
Thank you. We've got 5 minutes left. So it's Kitty at the back there, the gentleman beside her. Is there anyone else over there who's got a question while we're at it? And gentleman at the back there. So just Kitty Donaldson, first of all.
Thank you, Kitty Donaldson from Bloomberg News. I'm afraid, Foreign Secretary, I didn't quite understand your answer on the ECHR. It seems to be one of the emerging themes of the conference. Could you just explain in words of one syllable whether you were for or against leaving?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Foreign Secretary. I'm not only Conservative member and candidate, I'm also North Korean escapee. I escaped twice from North Korea. I was imprisoned 4 times, 3 times in China, and 1 time was in North Korea. And I was once repatriated by North Korea. And last week I spoke at the United Nations about repatriation issues by Chinese authorities. And when they sent back to North Korea, they end up in prison camps, and women sexually abused, and a lot of horrendous and all people executed. There are many in political prison as well. And I understand you also visited South Korea and went to Korean border, and I was carefully following your news. My question is particularly since I also personally experienced repatriation, where I experienced North Korean prison and 3 times in China, and also many people are still being repatriated by Chinese authorities over the past 20 years. Would you please have a dialogue with South Korean authorities and Chinese authorities, encourage China to allow North Korean escapees to go to South Korea? North Korean escapees, we do not want to stay in China. We want to go to South Korea. Under One Korea policy, South Korea offers citizenship, and Britain take a global role. I would be very grateful if there is any comment, if you could contribute. Thank you.
Thank you. And then just finally, gentleman here, please.
Yes, I work for the Iraq-Britain Business Council, and we had a meeting earlier this week with an ambassador from the Gulf, and they were quite clear that there seems to be a strong perception that America, and particularly the British, are withdrawing from the Gulf, and of course that's creating a vacuum with Russia and China moving in. Maybe you'd like to comment.
Thank you. And I'm going to begin, James. I'm going to put my former journalist hat on and be very clear. They wanted a one-word answer on the ECHR.
Of course, which you're not going to get. So the point I'm making is I don't feel that in order to achieve what we need to achieve to protect our borders, we are necessitated to leave the ECHR. The point is that we have demonstrated success, and I have no doubt that the decisions that we have made are completely within the boundaries of international law. So you're saying it's an emerging question, only because journalists keep raising it with me, because actually it's not something that any member has raised with me as yet. So that's my position. As I say, reform is important, but I do think that our position is entirely in accordance with international law. With regard to the repatriation point, it's an incredibly important point. Can I just congratulate you for your resilience on this? Funnily enough, I had Park Jin. I had lunch with him at the middle of this week. And we're going to be increasingly doing a lot more work with Korea. And DPRK, of course, is a topic that comes up very, very regularly. I will give you this assurance that this is something that we will discuss with the Korean authorities. I can't make a promise further than that, but you've raised a really, really important point, and I will bring it up. And with regard to the situation in the Gulf, I think, look, when I became a minister there, it was raised with me. I think there were a number of things that conspired to bring that viewpoint into the minds of many people in the region. I think the fact that when we had a hung parliament, we didn't travel as much as we should have done. We were then delayed with COVID, and because we spent so much time talking about Brexit-related issues, the narrative coming out of the UK was very EU focused. All we can do is repair that by visibility, by visiting them, encouraging them to visit us. It's an incredibly important part of the reason, both for prosperity and security reasons. But we've got to prove it by doing it, saying it. As I said to Seb, saying it ain't enough. You got to do it. It's about results. And I intend to kind of change that perception through our actions.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to ask one last very quick bonus question before we wrap up. There was a former Foreign Secretary, a man who you worked with at City Hall, who was your predecessor, who went from the Foreign Office onto other things later in life. Could you ever foresee that for yourself?
Is that Viagra?
I think that's a mint, James.
Oh, right, okay.
That was a very good distraction technique from that question there.
Not my first rodeo. So look, I love the job that I've got. And I know this is such a boring answer. It is an unbelievable privilege to serve in this role. It is one of the great offices of state. It is one of the best jobs in global politics. And you know, if I had the stamina and a magic wand, I'd be quite happy to have this as being, you know, the role that I stayed in until I turn up my toes. Now, I am quite sure there will be a whole load of competitive, talented people aspiring to be the UK Foreign Secretary. But as long as I've got a say in the matter, I'm going to keep delivering in my role. I've got a fantastic ministerial, very experienced and fantastic ministerial team. The world is a fascinating place. There's serious work to be done, and I mean the simple truth of the matter. And having had the chance to work with the Prime Minister, and I confess I wasn't from his kind of, you know, political tribe previously. I'd never worked with him, never worked with the Treasury. I knew him personally. Always gotten very, very well with him. He's always been good as gold in his relationships with me, but I never worked with him directly. When you do see him working up close and personal, the work rate that he has, the amount of intellectual effort that he applies to every decision that he makes, his willingness to make the difficult decisions and then stick to his guns having made them is genuinely admirable. So I want to see him take us into the next election, win the next election, and lead us in our unprecedented, was it fifth Parliament, and I would love to be Foreign Secretary throughout that. That's my plan.
And that means you're saying we, the Conservatives, will win the next election?
That's my plan.
Right, well, I think that's a very good, clear answer on that one. Now, James, clearly you talked about your passion for being Foreign Secretary. Everyone who's heard you here can hear that, and the amazing travels and work that you've done, and doing that very important work with Ukraine, with taking the pragmatic view on China, working closely with America, and making sure we're in the right place with Brussels. But thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. Thank you all for your questions and coming, and I hope you've enjoyed it. And please come to the rest of Onward's fantastic jam-bursting programme that we have over the next couple of days. But for now, could you please all put your hands together and please thank the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly.